On the morning of March 17, 1943, in a wood-paneled office tucked away in the labyrinthine corridors of Berlin's military intelligence headquarters, a German admiral sat alone with a single sheet of paper. Outside, the city was still reeling from the winter's devastation at Stalingrad. The streets bore the scars of Allied bombing raids. Rationing had tightened. The invincibility that had once intoxicated the Third Reich was beginning to crack. But inside that quiet room, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris held something far more dangerous than a casualty report or a map of retreating front lines. He held a piece of raw intelligence, a summary compiled from a dozen different sources across neutral countries and enemy territories, vetted by his best analysts, cross-referenced with intercepted communications, and corroborated by Allied agents who had risked their lives to send the information. And what it described was something that seemed to defy the laws of industrial reality. The report was concise, no more than a few paragraphs. But its contents were more explosive than any 1,000-pound bomb that had fallen on German soil. It didn't describe a superweapon. It didn't reveal a secret army massing in the shadows. It described a factory. An American factory, an ocean away on a stretch of farmland in Michigan that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every single hour. 60 minutes, one complete aircraft, not a prototype. Not a handful of elite models built by master craftsmen, but a fully operational, combat-ready B-24 Liberator rolling off an assembly line with the regularity of an automobile. To the men of the German High Command, this was absurd. It was a joke. A piece of American propaganda so laughable, so transparently ridiculous, that it barely warranted a second glance. But to the spies who had gathered this information, who had coded messages in invisible ink, who had bribed factory workers and photographed blueprints, and risked torture and execution to send this truth back to Berlin, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in cold, hard numbers. It was the moment they knew, with chilling mathematical certainty, that the war was already lost. This is the story of that devastating truth. A truth too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe. A truth that Admiral Canaris tried desperately to communicate to a leadership blinded by ideology and arrogance. It's the story of how the denial of a single fact, the refusal to accept an uncomfortable reality, sealed the fate of the Third Reich and determined the outcome of the Second World War. It's a story about intelligence and denial, about industrial might and ideological blindness, about the men and women who saw the future and the leaders who refused to listen. This is a World War II documentary about the day the truth arrived in Berlin and how nobody in power was willing to hear it. Before we dive deeper into this incredible untold story of World War II, if you're fascinated by these hidden moments that changed history, take just a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into military history and the Second World War. And I'd love to know, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from right now. It's amazing to see how this community spans the globe, all connected by a passion for understanding the real stories behind the war documentary footage we've all seen. Now, let's step back into that Berlin office in 1943 and understand exactly who this admiral was and why his warning mattered so much. To understand the weight of that March morning, you have to understand the man holding that report. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was not a typical member of Hitler's inner circle. Born in 1887 in the Ruhr Valley, he came from a family with deep roots in German industry and military tradition. He had joined the Imperial German Navy as a young man, serving with distinction in the First World War. He was a career officer, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of German military politics through the chaos of the Weimar Republic and into the rise of the Nazi Party. But unlike the fanatical true believers who surrounded Hitler, unlike the party ideologues who saw the world through the blood and soil mythology of National Socialism, Canaris was something rarer and more dangerous to a totalitarian regime. He was a realist. As the head of the Abwehr, which was the intelligence service of the German armed forces, the high command of the Wehrmacht, Canaris commanded a sprawling global network. The Abwehr had agents in every major capital, informants in factories and ports, analysts who sifted through mountains of data looking for patterns. In the early years of the war, from 1939 through 1941, the Abwehr had been instrumental in Germany's stunning victories. Intelligence on French and British troop movements, assessments of Soviet industrial capacity, reconnaissance on Allied naval positions. All of this had flowed through Canaris's organization and into the hands of German military planners. The Blitzkrieg, that lightning war that had shocked the world, had been built in part on accurate intelligence. Know your enemy. Know his strengths. Know his weaknesses. Exploit them ruthlessly. That was the Abwehr's mandate, and Canaris had executed it with cold professionalism. But by 1943, the war had changed. The mood in Berlin had shifted. The disaster at Stalingrad, where an entire German army had been surrounded and destroyed in the frozen ruins of that Soviet city, had been a psychological earthquake. Over 300,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The myth of German invincibility had shattered against the brutal reality of Soviet resistance and the relentless Russian winter. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was no longer advancing. It was bleeding. The Red Army, once dismissed as a disorganized rabble, was revealing itself to be a grinding, implacable machine, fueled by Soviet industrial production and the willingness to accept staggering casualties. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps, once the pride of the German military, was being squeezed between British forces advancing from Egypt and American forces landing in Morocco and Algeria. The Desert War, which had seemed like a sideshow, was becoming a catastrophe. And in the Atlantic, the U-boat campaign, which Hitler had believed would starve Britain into submission, was starting to falter as Allied convoys adopted new tactics and technologies. Yet at the very top of the German command structure, a dangerous sense of denial lingered. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated in his fortified headquarters, surrounded by sycophants and yes-men, was detaching further from reality. He believed that the German war effort was fundamentally a contest of willpower. The German soldier was superior. German science and engineering were the finest in the world. German racial purity and discipline gave the Reich an inherent advantage. Victory was not just possible. It was destiny. Setbacks were temporary. Losses could be reversed through sheer force of will and fanatical determination. This was the ideological framework that governed decision-making at the highest levels, and it was utterly disconnected from the grim arithmetic of modern industrial warfare. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold reality. He understood something that the Nazi leadership, blinded by ideology, could not grasp. Modern warfare in the 20th century was not primarily a clash of armies or a test of individual courage. It was a collision of economies. It was a brutal equation of steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, and manpower. It was about who could build more tanks, more planes, more ships, more bullets. It was about industrial capacity and logistical networks and the ability to mobilize an entire society for total war. And from his perch at the center of the Abwehr's global intelligence web, Canaris was starting to see numbers that terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany was not just losing the production war. Numbers that suggested the Third Reich was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it couldn't even imagine, let alone counter. The intelligence hadn't arrived in a single flash of revelation. It had been building slowly, a creeping dread assembled from dozens of different sources scattered across the world. It started as whispers, fragments of information picked up by German agents operating in neutral countries. A businessman returning from a trip to the United States mentioned a factory so vast it had its own internal weather systems, where rain could form near the ceiling on humid days. A Swedish diplomat in Washington, D.C. forwarded reports on American production targets that seemed to have an extra zero numbers so large they appeared to be typographical errors. A German agent in Lisbon received a coded message from a contact in the American industrial heartland, describing an aircraft assembly line that moved with the methodical precision of automobile manufacturing, something unprecedented in the aviation industry. Individually, each report could be dismissed. Intelligence work is full of exaggerations, misinformation, and propaganda. Agents sometimes embellish to justify their existence. Sources can be unreliable. But as these reports flowed into the Abwehr headquarters on the Terpitzufer in Berlin, as Canaris's analysts began to compile and cross-reference them, a terrifying pattern emerged. They all told the same story. They all pointed to the same location. They all made the same seemingly ridiculous claim. There was a massive industrial complex in Michigan, near the city of Detroit, called Willow Run, and the Ford Motor Company, the same company that had revolutionized automobile production with the Model T, was applying those exact mass production techniques to the construction of a four-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The goal, according to multiple independent sources, was to eventually roll one complete aircraft out of the factory, not once a day, not once every few hours, but once every single hour. To the German mind, steeped in traditional European industrial practices, this was not just optimistic, it was impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a technological marvel, a beast of engineering. It was an 18-ton behemoth constructed from over 1.5 million individual parts. It had 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines, each one a complex piece of machinery in itself. It had hydraulic systems, electrical systems, defensive armament, bomb bays, navigation equipment, sophisticated radio gear. The wings alone spanned over 110 feet. German factories, which represented the pride of European engineering tradition, which employed highly skilled craftsmen and engineers, took weeks or even months to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the Heinkel He 177 or the Focke-Wulf Condor. These were not simple machines. They required precision, expertise, and time. The idea that the Americans, a nation that Nazi propaganda had long mocked as a chaotic, racially mixed society, a nation of shopkeepers and consumers obsessed with comfort and luxury, could build such a complex weapon of war in 60 minutes was not just unbelievable, it was insulting. It contradicted everything the Nazi ideology taught about racial superiority and the inherent advantages of authoritarian organization. If this were true, it would mean that a diverse, democratic, capitalist society could outproduce the pure, disciplined, centrally planned economy of the Third Reich. The implications were staggering and unacceptable. Canaris and his senior officers did the mathematics. If the Americans could actually achieve this production rate, 1 bomber every hour meant 24 bombers every day. Over 700 bombers every month from a single factory. At the time, in early 1943, the entire German aircraft industry, spread across dozens of factories, was struggling to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. The Luftwaffe was still a formidable force, but its production rates were measured in the hundreds per month for all aircraft types combined, including fighters and transports. The idea of a single American factory matching or exceeding Germany's total heavy bomber output was almost beyond comprehension. But the Abwehr spies confirmed the details. The information was vetted through multiple channels. German agents in Switzerland, which maintained relations with both sides, cross-referenced production data. Even Japanese naval attaches, Germany's own allies who had access to information through their embassy in Washington before Pearl Harbor, and through other intelligence channels afterward, were sending back reports on American production numbers, and the tone of these Japanese reports was telling. It was not triumphant, it was not dismissive. It was tinged with dread. The Japanese military, which was also fighting an industrial war against the United States in the Pacific, was beginning to realize the scale of American manufacturing capacity. And they were trying to warn their German allies about what was coming. The data was solid. Multiple independent sources, corroborating evidence, photographs of construction, intercepted communications. But the question that haunted the German leadership was this: how could this possibly be true? How could a workforce composed of what the Nazis considered inferior people, women, African Americans, immigrants, the very mongrel population that Nazi racial theory claimed was weak and degenerate, achieve this kind of industrial miracle? How could a messy, inefficient democracy, where workers had rights and could strike, where there was no central authoritarian control, where capitalist competition supposedly created chaos, mobilize with such terrifying focus and efficiency? In the Nazi worldview, strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. The Aryan race, disciplined by a strong leader, organized by a totalitarian state, was supposed to be inherently superior to the chaotic democracies of the West. America had neither racial purity nor authoritarian control. Therefore, the reports had to be wrong. They had to be exaggerated. They had to be part of a massive deception campaign designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale. The alternative was too horrible to consider. Because if these numbers were accurate, if this factory in Michigan was real and functioning as described, it meant the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or generals or tactics. It was a war of factories. It was a war of economics. And if the intelligence pointing to March 1943 as a critical moment was accurate, If this projection was based on real construction timelines and real production tests, then Germany had already lost. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was simply a matter of time. As one of Canaris's senior Abwehr officers reportedly put it in a private conversation, a conversation that would later be referenced in post-war interrogations and memoirs, if these numbers are correct, if the Americans can do what our sources claim they can do, then Germany has already lost this war. It is no longer a question of willpower or courage or superior tactics. It is a question of simple mathematics. And the mathematics are not in our favor. Half a world away from that quiet Berlin office, on a stretch of flat farmland west of Detroit, Michigan, the impossible was becoming very, very real. This was Willow Run, and there was nothing else like it anywhere on Earth. The story of how this factory came to exist is itself a remarkable chapter in World War II history. A story that reveals the transformation of American society and industry in response to the growing threat of fascism in Europe and the eventual entry of the United States into the Second World War. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, he articulated a vision for America's role in the coming conflict. The United States, he argued, must become the great supplier of weapons and materials to the nations fighting against totalitarianism. Britain was standing alone against Nazi Germany, battered by the Blitz, its cities burning under Luftwaffe bombs, its Atlantic convoys hunted by U-boats. The Soviet Union would soon be invaded and fighting for survival. China was battling Japanese aggression. And America, protected by two oceans, blessed with vast natural resources and the world's most advanced industrial base, had a moral obligation and a strategic interest in supporting those who resisted tyranny. But Roosevelt's vision required a transformation of American industry on a scale never before attempted. Automobile factories had to become aircraft factories. Civilian production had to give way to military production. And this transformation had to happen fast. The U.S. government began reaching out to major industrial corporations, asking them to apply their expertise to military manufacturing. And few corporations were more symbolic of American industrial might than the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford was a complex and controversial figure. He was a brilliant industrialist who had revolutionized manufacturing with the moving assembly line, making automobiles affordable for ordinary Americans and transforming the landscape of the 20th century. He was also a man with deeply problematic views, including well-documented anti-Semitism that had earned him disturbing praise from Adolf Hitler himself in the 1920s and 1930s. By 1940, Ford was in his late 70s, and much of the day-to-day operation of the company was handled by his son Edsel Ford and by Charles Sorensen, Ford's legendary production chief, the man who had helped Henry perfect the assembly line decades earlier. When the government approached Ford about producing aircraft, the initial response was hesitant. Ford had famously resisted military production during World War I, and Henry Ford himself had pacifist leanings, though these were complicated and contradictory. But by 1940, with war engulfing Europe and the threat to American interests growing, the company agreed to take on the challenge. The question was, what would they build and how? The Army Air Corps, which would later become the Army Air Forces, needed heavy bombers. They needed them in vast quantities. The B-24 Liberator, designed by Consolidated Aircraft, was one of the primary heavy bombers in development. It was a modern aircraft, more advanced than the B-17 Flying Fortress in some respects, with a longer range and a higher cruising speed. But it was also complex, and traditional aircraft manufacturing methods were slow. Aircraft were built almost like custom products, with skilled workers hand-fitting parts, making adjustments, solving problems as they arose. Production rates were measured in dozens per month, not hundreds. Charles Sorensen looked at the B-24 and saw something different. He saw a product that could be deconstructed, rationalized, and mass-produced using Ford's techniques. He made a bold promise, some would say an arrogant promise, to the government. Ford could build B-24s just like they built Model Ts and Model As. Not one at a time, but on a moving assembly line, with standardized parts and specialized workers, at a rate that would dwarf anything the traditional aircraft industry could achieve. The old guard of the aviation industry was skeptical, even contemptuous. You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight, one aircraft company executive reportedly sneered, suggesting that automobile makers didn't have the precision or expertise for aircraft construction. Ford and Sorensen were determined to prove them wrong. And to do it, they needed a factory unlike any that had ever been built. The site chosen was a stretch of rural land near Ypsilanti, Michigan, along Willow Run Creek, about 30 miles west of Detroit. It was farmland, mostly flat, which was ideal for a massive single-story facility, and in 1941, construction began. The architect was Albert Kahn, a legendary industrial architect who had designed hundreds of factories for Ford and other companies. Kahn was a genius of functional design, a man who understood how to create spaces that maximized efficiency and workflow. And for Willow Run, he designed something unprecedented. The main assembly building was a single room. Not a complex of interconnected buildings, but one vast, continuous space. It stretched for over half a mile in length. At its peak, the building covered over 3.5 million square feet of floor space. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to about 65 football fields under one roof. It was so large that it was called the most enormous room in the history of man. The local press described it as a building so big it had its own horizon. Workers inside reported that on humid days, clouds could form near the high ceiling. And here's a detail that captures the sheer scale and the uniqueness of this project. The assembly line inside Willow Run had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn partway through the building. Why? Because if it had continued in a straight line, the factory would have crossed the boundary between Washtenaw County and Wayne County, and Ford would have had to pay taxes in two different counties. So to avoid this, the engineers designed a system of massive turntables that could rotate partially assembled bombers 90 degrees, allowing the assembly line to continue in a new direction. This feature became known as the tax turn, and it was a testament to both American ingenuity and the sometimes absurd practicalities of industrial planning. But the real revolution at Willow Run wasn't the building itself, it was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford and Charles Sorensen had spent decades perfecting the concept of the moving assembly line. The idea was simple but transformative. Instead of workers moving to the product moved to the workers. Each worker was stationed at a fixed position and performed a single, repetitive task as the product moved past on a conveyor system. One person drilled holes. Another installed a specific component. Another riveted a panel. This specialization allowed for incredible speed and efficiency because workers became expert at their one task, and the entire process flowed like a river, continuous and relentless. Applying this to aircraft construction required rethinking everything. The B-24 Liberator had to be deconstructed into manageable sub-assemblies. The wings, the fuselage sections, the tail assembly, the engines, each of these was built separately on its own smaller assembly line, and then they came together on the main line for final assembly. Ford engineers created massive jigs and fixtures to hold parts in place, standardized every component to reduce the need for hand fitting, and trained workers to perform specific tasks with machine-like precision. This training was critical. Traditional aircraft workers were highly skilled craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade. Ford didn't have years. The company needed thousands of workers, and it needed them fast. So Ford created an apprentice school at Willow Run that could churn out trained workers in a matter of weeks, not years. Workers learned one specific task, practiced it until they could do it with their eyes closed, and then went to their station on the line. It was industrial education on a mass scale, and it worked. And who were these workers? This is where the story of Willow Run becomes a direct contradiction of Nazi ideology. And it's why the German leadership found the reports so impossible to believe. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. And they were not the master race of Nazi propaganda. They were a reflection of American diversity. Nearly a third of the workforce, approximately 14,000 workers, were women. These were the iconic Rosie the Riveters of World War II lore, women who had entered the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers to fill the gap left by men who had gone to fight. They operated rivet guns, welding torches, drill presses. They worked on wings and fuselage panels and engine mounts. One of these women, Rose Monroe, became a real-life inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter propaganda character after she was featured in a promotional film. She was a riveter on the B-24 night shift, and her image helped recruit thousands more women into war work. The workforce was also racially diverse. Over 9% of the workers at Willow Run were African American, employed in a range of positions though still facing significant discrimination and segregation in housing and facilities. Another 3% were classified as disabled. Workers who in many cases had been told they couldn't contribute to the war effort, but who found meaningful work at Willow Run. There were immigrants from Poland, Italy, Greece, and dozens of other countries. There were young people straight out of high school and older workers who had come out of retirement. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week, around the clock. The factory never slept. It was a relentless 24-hour hum of rivets and engines and moving metal. This was the very mongrel society that Adolf Hitler loved to mock in his speeches. The chaotic mix of races and genders and backgrounds that Nazi ideology claimed was weak and degenerate. And yet, they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The early days of Willow Run were rough. The factory was so ambitious, so unprecedented, that there were inevitable problems. Coordination issues, supply chain bottlenecks, quality control concerns. In late 1942 and early 1943, the factory was producing bombers, but slowly, and some of the early aircraft had defects. The press, always eager for a story, began calling it Will It Run? Instead of Willow Run, a mocking play on words that suggested the factory was a failure. But as 1943 rolled on, as the workers gained experience, as the supply chains smoothed out, as the engineers solved problems and optimized processes, the machine hit its stride. Raw materials flowed in one end of that half-mile-long building: aluminum sheets, steel tubing, engines from Pratt & Whitney, propellers, instruments, glass, rubber, wiring, thousands of different components, and out the other end. 63 minutes later, at peak production, an 18-ton, 4-engine heavy bomber emerged, fully assembled, ready to be tested and flown to war. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't exaggeration. It was a new kind of warfare by industrial might. And America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. The assembly line applied to instruments of total war. While German scientists and engineers were working on futuristic wonder weapons, experimental jets and rockets that would arrive too late and in too few numbers, America was perfecting the most devastating weapon of all mass production. And Admiral Canaris, sitting in his Berlin office, understood exactly what this meant for Germany's future. Armed with this terrifying truth, documented and verified by his intelligence network, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris faced perhaps the most daunting challenge of his career: penetrating the ideological fortress that surrounded Adolf Hitler. It was a wall built not of concrete and steel, but of arrogance, willful ignorance, and fanatical belief. And its chief architect, its most zealous defender, was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring was a figure of contradictions, a man whose early achievements had given way to corruption, excess, and catastrophic strategic blindness. He was a genuine World War I flying ace who had taken over command of the legendary Richthofen Squadron after the Red Baron's death. He had been wounded in the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch alongside Hitler, a moment that cemented his position as one of the Nazi Party's earliest and most loyal members. As Hitler rose to power, Göring rose with him, accumulating titles and responsibilities: head of the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, Minister of Aviation, plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, which gave him enormous control over the German economy, and eventually Reichsmarschall, a rank specially created for him, making him the highest-ranking military officer in the Third Reich. But by 1943, Göring had become something else entirely. He was profoundly corrupt, looting art from occupied territories for his personal collection, living in obscene luxury at his vast estate Karenhall, while ordinary Germans faced rationing and hardship. He was addicted to morphine, a dependency that had started after his war wound and had spiraled into a daily habit that affected his judgment and temperament. And most dangerously for Germany's war effort, he was deeply egotistical, a man who could not accept criticism or admit error, especially regarding the Luftwaffe, which he saw as his personal creation and legacy. More than anyone else in the Nazi leadership, Hermann Göring was responsible for the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had been a terror weapon, destroying the Polish Air Force on the ground, supporting the Blitzkrieg through France, bombing Rotterdam into submission. Göring had famously promised that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, a boast that had already been proven false by British RAF raids, but that he stubbornly defended. He saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power, the man who understood aerial warfare better than anyone. And his worldview was thoroughly infected with Nazi racial ideology. When Admiral Canaris brought the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run to the attention of the German High Command, when he presented the carefully documented intelligence about American bomber production capabilities, Hermann Göring's reaction was not concern or alarm. It was contempt. It was laughter. The reports were dismissed out of hand. Americans cannot build airplanes, Göring famously sneered in one high-level meeting. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades. This wasn't just a throwaway insult. It was a perfect distillation of the Nazi worldview, a worldview that would doom Germany. To Göring and the Nazi leadership, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society obsessed with comfort and luxury goods. They were a mongrel race, as Nazi propaganda constantly emphasized, lacking the discipline and martial spirit of the pure German people. The idea that such a culture, such a chaotic mix of races and backgrounds, could mobilize to mass-produce a sophisticated weapon of war like a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, simply impossible. It violated every principle of Nazi racial theory. Therefore, the reports had to be false, a clumsy piece of American propaganda designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale. You can imagine how maddening this was for Admiral Canaris. Here was a man who had spent his entire career dealing with hard facts, cold intelligence, strategic reality. He was presenting mathematical certainty, documented evidence from multiple independent sources, to a man living in an ideological fantasy. Canaris tried to press the issue. His agents had provided specifics. They had descriptions of the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tools and jigs, the sheer capital investment that Ford had poured into Willow Run. They had production timelines, projected output figures, even details about the workforce and the training programs. Göring wouldn't hear it. He and his inner circle at the Luftwaffe had constructed their own narrative, an article of faith that could not be questioned. German engineering was superior. German aircraft were superior. The Luftwaffe pilots were the best in the world. To question this wasn't just a question of military assessment. It was heresy against the fundamental principles of National Socialism. And there was another factor at play, one that made it psychologically impossible for Göring to accept Canaris's report. Admitting the truth would be a devastating confession of his own failure. If Göring accepted that the Americans were about to outproduce Germany by a factor of 10 or more in heavy bombers, it would mean his own intelligence services had completely missed the most critical industrial development of the entire war. It would mean his promises to Hitler about Luftwaffe supremacy were hollow. It would mean his strategic decisions, his allocation of resources, his dismissal of long-range bomber development in favor of tactical aircraft had been catastrophically wrong. And it would mean his beloved Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies by sheer numerical superiority, overwhelmed by an avalanche of American aircraft that his pilots, no matter how skilled or brave, could not possibly stop. For a man of Göring's ego, for a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in the Luftwaffe and in his position as Hitler's closest companion, this was unthinkable. So the report went nowhere. It was filed away, dismissed, buried under the immense weight of Göring's pride and delusion. The wall of denial stood firm. And Admiral Canaris was left holding a truth that could potentially save Germany from years of futile bloodshed, a truth that could inform strategic decisions, a truth that might even have led to a negotiated peace if the Nazi leadership had been capable of rational calculation, but he had no one in power willing to listen. The next step, the final and most dangerous step, was to somehow get the information directly to the Führer himself, to Adolf Hitler. But presenting unwelcome facts in Hitler's presence was not just difficult. It was potentially suicidal. By 1943, Adolf Hitler was increasingly isolated from reality. Whether at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, or at the Wolf's Lair, his fortified headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, the atmosphere around him was oppressive, paranoid, and surreal. Reality in Hitler's headquarters was whatever the Führer decreed it to be. Military briefings had become less about honest strategic assessment and more about reinforcing whatever Hitler wanted to believe. Officers who brought bad news were accused of defeatism. Generals who questioned his decisions were relieved of command. The men around him had learned to filter information, to present only what would please him or at least not provoke his volcanic rage. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking time bomb. Hitler's view of the United States was a bizarre mixture of contempt and grudging respect. He saw America as vast and wealthy, yes, but also as fundamentally weak and degenerate. It was a mongrel nation, in his view, crippled by racial impurity, its vigor sapped by Jewish financiers and mongrelized bloodlines, its culture obsessed with comfort and entertainment rather than martial discipline. He believed that democracies were inherently inefficient and indecisive, that they lacked the unity of purpose that came from authoritarian leadership. When the Abwehr's projections finally reached Hitler's attention, when Canaris or his representatives managed to present the intelligence about American bomber production, the projections of 1 bomber per hour, over 650 bombers per month from a single factory, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but with even more venom, even more ideological rigidity. This wasn't just a strategic problem to Hitler. It was a personal insult to his entire worldview. The numbers, he declared, were inflated fantasies, Jewish propaganda designed to demoralize Germany. The Americans, he insisted, were incapable of such feats. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, was one of the few men in Hitler's inner circle with genuine technical expertise and an understanding of industrial production. Speer was a trained architect, yes, but he had also overseen massive construction projects and had a grasp of logistics and manufacturing. In his post-war memoirs and in Allied interrogations after the war, Speer would admit a chilling truth. He knew, or at least strongly suspected, that if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. The war would become a simple contest of production capacity, and Germany would lose. The final tally for the Willow Run bomber plant was staggering beyond belief. At its absolute peak production rate in 1944, the plant was producing a complete B-24 Liberator heavy bomber not every hour, as the early projections had suggested, but every 63 minutes. 63 minutes from raw materials entering one end of that half-mile-long assembly line to a fully functional 18-ton aircraft rolling out the other end. Think about that for a moment. In the time it takes to watch a single episode of a television show, American workers were building a sophisticated weapon of war containing over 1.5 million parts, 4 massive engines, complex hydraulic and electrical systems, defensive armament, navigation equipment, everything needed to fly across an ocean and drop tons of bombs on enemy targets. By the time the last B-24 rolled off the Willow Run assembly line in the summer of 1945, the Ford Motor Company had built 6,972 complete B-24 Liberators at that single facility. But that wasn't all. Ford had also produced another 1,893 knockdown kits, which were disassembled B-24s that could be packed in crates, shipped overseas, and reassembled at forward bases closer to the combat zones. These kits allowed the Army Air Forces to have assembled bombers ready in the Pacific Theater or in Britain without the risk and time involved in flying complete aircraft across oceans. Think about that number. A single American factory, built in less than 2 years on what had been farmland, produced nearly 7,000 complete 4-engine heavy bombers. To put this in perspective, the entire German aircraft industry, spread across dozens of factories throughout Germany and occupied Europe, utilizing slave labor and prisoners of war, operating in a totalitarian state with centralized planning and unlimited authority to commandeer resources, managed to produce approximately 5,000 heavy bombers of all types during the entire 6-year span of the war. One American factory, staffed largely by women and minorities, operating in a democratic society with labor protections and worker rights, outproduced the entire industrial capacity of the Third Reich. And Willow Run was just one factory. It wasn't even the only facility producing B-24s. Consolidated Aircraft's factories in San Diego and Fort Worth were also building Liberators. When you add up all the production facilities, the United States manufactured over 18,400 B-24 Liberators during the war, making it the most produced heavy bomber in all of history, a record it still holds today. No other aircraft type, before or since, has been produced in such quantities in the heavy bomber category. But even that doesn't capture the full scale of American industrial mobilization. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the United States manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft of all types. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, reconnaissance planes, patrol aircraft, the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Germany, in the same period, produced around 94,000 combat aircraft total. The Soviet Union, which had its own massive industrial base, and which was fighting for survival on the Eastern Front, produced approximately 157,000 aircraft. Even Britain, which had been at war since 1939 and which had mobilized its entire society for the war effort, produced around 131,000 aircraft. The American industrialist William Snutson, who had been brought into the Roosevelt administration specifically to help coordinate industrial mobilization, and who had previously been president of General Motors, summarized it perfectly when he said, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible." That sentence captures the essential truth of why the Allies won World War II. Not because Allied soldiers were braver than German soldiers' courage was displayed on all sides. Not because Allied generals were necessarily more brilliant than German generals, there were talented commanders in every army. The Allies won because they outproduced the Axis powers by such an overwhelming margin that no amount of tactical brilliance or individual courage could compensate for the material imbalance. And the German failure to believe this, the failure that Admiral Canaris had witnessed firsthand and tried desperately to communicate, wasn't fundamentally a failure of intelligence gathering. German spies did their job remarkably well. They gathered accurate information. They sent detailed reports. They provided specifics about production capacity, workforce numbers, factory layouts, all the raw data that any rational leadership would need to make informed strategic decisions. The failure was a failure of acceptance, a total cognitive collapse at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. It was an inability, or perhaps more accurately an unwillingness, to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own propaganda, imprisoned within their own racist worldview, simply could not believe the numbers they were seeing. Their entire ideology was built on the premise of racial superiority, on the idea that the pure Aryan race, organized and disciplined by a strong authoritarian state, was inherently superior to the chaotic mixed-race democracies of the West. If they accepted that America, with its diverse population and democratic system, could outproduce Germany by a factor of 3 or 5 or 10 to 1, then the entire ideological foundation of National Socialism crumbled. If mongrel democracies could outperform pure authoritarian states, then what was the point of racial purity? What was the value of authoritarian control? The whole edifice of Nazi belief collapsed in the face of American production numbers. So they chose not to believe. They chose to dismiss the intelligence as propaganda. They chose to trust their prejudices over empirical facts. And they were defeated not by some secret wonder weapon, not by a brilliant tactical maneuver, but by simple arithmetic, by cold industrial mathematics. They were buried by an avalanche of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they disdained, men and women of all backgrounds, all races, all religions, working together in a free society united by a common cause. The spies who had risked everything to gather this intelligence were right. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who had tried to force the Nazi leadership to confront reality, was right. March 17, 1943, the day that intelligence report landed on his desk, really was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, delivered by brave men and women who understood what they were seeing. And nobody in power was willing to listen. Nobody wanted to believe that their entire worldview, their entire ideological framework, was about to be proven catastrophically wrong by the simple reality of American industrial capacity. In the end, the story of Willow Run and the German refusal to believe its existence is not just a fascinating footnote in World War II history, not just an interesting anecdote for history documentaries and military history enthusiasts. It's a profound lesson about the danger of ideological thinking, about what happens when leaders build their decisions on prejudice and propaganda rather than on facts and evidence. The Third Reich, for all its early military successes, for all its technological innovations, for all its fearsome reputation, was not defeated because of a lack of information. The Abwehr provided excellent intelligence throughout the war. Germany had spies in the right places, analysts who could interpret data, reports that accurately described Allied capabilities. Germany was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their ideology over reality. They built an entire worldview on the foundations of racial mythology, on pseudoscientific theories about blood and soil, on fantasies about Aryan superiority, and the inevitable triumph of will over material conditions. And when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, when the evidence became undeniable, when American bombers filled the skies in numbers that made mockery of every Nazi boast, the entire structure was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim, factual reports, and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Göring was not just a disagreement about production statistics. It was a battle for the soul of the German war effort, a battle between evidence and fantasy, between rational strategic planning and ideological fanaticism. And fantasy won that battle. The ideologues triumphed over the realists. And in doing so, they doomed not just their own regime but millions of people to 2 more years of brutal, unnecessary warfare. If the Nazi leadership had been capable of accepting the truth in March 1943, if they had looked at those production numbers and understood what they meant, it's possible, though far from certain, that they might have sought some kind of negotiated settlement, might have tried to end the war before the total destruction that eventually came. But they couldn't. Their ideology wouldn't let them. And so the war ground on, becoming more savage and more destructive with each passing month, until the Third Reich was literally reduced to rubble and the Nazi leadership was dead or captured or fleeing. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands in historical memory as a monument to everything that Nazi ideology sought to destroy. It represents the power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism, for all its boasts about efficiency and discipline, could never match. The factory floor at Willow Run was a microcosm of the Allied cause. A chaotic, inefficient, by some measures, beautiful mess of humanity, women and men, black and white, young and old, native-born and immigrant, disabled and able-bodied, all working together toward a common goal. And when that diverse workforce was united, when they were mobilized in defense of freedom and democracy, when they had a clear purpose and the industrial tools to achieve it, they accomplished what Nazi ideology said was impossible. The legacy of that day in March 1943, when Admiral Canaris held that piece of paper and tried to make the German leadership see the truth, echoes through time with lessons that remain relevant today. It's a stark reminder that the most formidable obstacles we face, the most dangerous walls that imprison us, are not made of brick and mortar or steel and concrete. They are the walls we build in our own minds, the walls of ideology and prejudice, the walls constructed from comfortable lies and cherished beliefs that we refuse to question even when evidence demands it. Every government, every organization, every individual faces moments when reality conflicts with belief, when evidence contradicts what we want to be true. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can adjust our beliefs to match reality, painful as that might be. Or we can deny reality and cling to our beliefs, comfortable in the short term, but potentially catastrophic in the long run. The Nazi leadership chose denial, and it cost them everything. It cost Germany everything. It cost the world millions of lives and years of suffering. Today, Willow Run is mostly gone. The massive factory building, that most enormous room in the history of man, was partially demolished in the decades after the war. Parts of it were used for various industrial purposes. A small section has been preserved as a museum, a memorial to the men and women who worked there and to the incredible achievement of American wartime production. You can visit it, walk through a tiny fraction of that half-mile assembly line, see the photographs of Roswell Monroe and thousands of other workers, read the stories of how they built an airplane an hour when the world said it was impossible. The lesson of Willow Run, combined with the tragedy of Admiral Canaris and the willful blindness of the Nazi leadership, should humble anyone who thinks they have history figured out. Anyone who believes their ideology explains everything. Anyone who is tempted to dismiss uncomfortable facts because they conflict with cherished beliefs. The most important truths are often the ones we least want to hear. And the most dangerous leaders are those who surround themselves with yes-men who tell them only what they want to believe. In this age of information, where we have access to more data and evidence than any previous generation in human history, we also face new challenges in distinguishing fact from fiction, truth from propaganda. The story of March 1943, of good intelligence being rejected because it didn't fit the narrative, reminds us that having information is not enough. We must also have the intellectual honesty and the moral courage to accept what the information tells us, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it forces us to question our assumptions. For those of us who love history, who study World War II and military history and the great conflicts that shaped our modern world, stories like this are why we dig into archives and read memoirs and analyze documents. Because history is not just about dates and battles and famous generals. It's about human decisions, about the moments when individuals and leaders chose one path over another, about the consequences that rippled out from those choices. The Second World War was decided as much in that quiet Berlin office in March 1943 as it was on the beaches of Normandy or in the ruins of Stalingrad. Admiral Canaris, holding that piece of paper, seeing the truth and knowing it would be rejected, that moment mattered. It mattered to the outcome of the war, and it matters to us today as we try to understand how great nations rise and fall, how truth can be suppressed but never eliminated, how reality always, eventually wins. This has been the story of the day the truth arrived in Berlin, a deep dive into one of the most important intelligence failures in history. A military history documentary about the moment when American industrial might revealed itself and the Nazi leadership chose not to believe. Stories like this, hidden moments that changed everything, are what we explore on this channel. If you found this journey through World War II history valuable, if you're as fascinated as I am by these untold stories of the Second World War, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on so you don't miss the next documentary. Share this with anyone who loves real history, who wants to understand not just what happened but why it happened. And let me know in the comments, what aspect of this story surprised you most? Did you know about Willow Run before today? Have you visited the museum? What other World War II stories should we investigate next? Thank you for joining me for this exploration of history. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for the present, if we're willing to listen. But to say that in Hitler's presence, to admit that truth in 1943, would have been suicide professionally and perhaps literally. Hitler's response to defeatism was brutal. Officers were cashiered, imprisoned, sometimes executed. The SS was everywhere, watching, listening. Loyalty was defined not as telling the truth, but as maintaining faith in ultimate victory. So Speer, like so many others, remained silent or at best couched his concerns in such careful language that they lost all impact. The great confrontation that might have changed history, the moment when the Nazi leadership might have been forced to reckon with industrial reality, never really happened. There was no dramatic scene where Canaris stood before Hitler and laid out the facts. No moment of clarity where the truth cut through the fog of ideology. Instead, there was a series of muted encounters, filtered presentations, reports that were acknowledged and then dismissed. It was a collision between fact and dogma, between mathematical reality and ideological fantasy. And in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The Admiral's warning was not just ignored. It was seen as a symptom of weakness, of defeatism, of insufficient faith in the National Socialist cause. The men who brought uncomfortable truths were now viewed with suspicion. Their patriotism was questioned. Their loyalty was doubted. In Hitler's mind, shaped by decades of ideological indoctrination and his own megalomaniacal worldview, the war was fundamentally a test of will and blood, not of logistics and production capacity. Material factors could be overcome through superior spirit, through fanatical determination, through the inherent superiority of the German race. A single piece of paper, representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies who had risked torture and death to gather this intelligence, was brushed aside. It contained perhaps the most important strategic fact of the entire Second World War. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at an exponential rate that Germany could not hope to match, let alone exceed. The American industrial giant, which had been sleeping through the 1930s, constrained by the Great Depression and isolationist sentiment, was now fully awake and applying its vast resources to war production. And the decision that sealed Germany's fate was made not by explicit order, not through a formal policy declaration, but through stubborn refusal to see, through ideological blindness that was itself a form of suicide. The truth was rejected. The spies who had gathered it were dismissed as spreaders of enemy propaganda. The analysts who had verified it were accused of lacking fighting spirit. Admiral Canaris was silenced, marginalized, increasingly viewed not as the head of Germany's intelligence service but as a problem, a source of unwelcome pessimism in a regime that demanded optimistic fanaticism. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, in that refusal to accept an uncomfortable reality, the fate of millions of people was sealed. The war would continue for 2 more years, growing more brutal and more destructive with each passing month, even though the outcome was already determined by cold industrial mathematics. The consequences of that denial were inevitable. They came first as a distant rumble on the horizon, a threat that could still be ignored or explained away. Then they came as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Third Reich, A roar that grew louder and more relentless with each passing month until it drowned out everything else. Believing their own propaganda, convinced of their own superiority, the German High Command made a series of strategic decisions that, in hindsight, were catastrophically misguided. They continued to funnel enormous resources into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons that were supposed to turn the tide of the war through technological superiority rather than numerical advantage. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were impressive achievements in engineering. Yes, weapons that would influence post-war missile development and eventually lead to the space age. But in terms of their strategic impact on World War II, they were nearly meaningless. The V-weapons killed thousands of civilians in London and Antwerp. They caused terror and disruption, but they did nothing to stop the Allied advance or to protect German cities from the growing bomber offensive. The resources poured into these programs, the scientific talent, the manufacturing capacity, the rare materials, all of it might have been better spent on conventional weapons production, on more fighters to defend the Reich, on more anti-aircraft guns, on anything that could have slowed the industrial juggernaut that was building across the Atlantic. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was another example of impressive technology arriving too late and in too few numbers. The Me-262 was revolutionary, capable of speeds that conventional propeller-driven fighters could not match. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was devastating against Allied bombers. But Hitler, in one of his many disastrous interventions in military matters, insisted that it be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter, delaying its deployment. By the time significant numbers of Me-262s entered service in 1944, Germany lacked the fuel to fly them, the trained pilots to operate them, and the time to make a difference. The Luftwaffe had a handful of wonder weapons, but the Allies had thousands upon thousands of conventional aircraft. And those conventional aircraft, those B-24 Liberators rolling off the assembly line at Willow Run, were now turning the prophecy that Admiral Canaris had delivered into crushing reality. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied heavy bombers over Germany became a flood, then a deluge, then an apocalypse of steel and high explosives that no amount of German courage or skill could stop. The United States 8th Air Force, based in England, began its relentless strategic bombing campaign against German industry, infrastructure, and cities. The doctrine was controversial then and remains so now, but its effectiveness in degrading Germany's war-making capacity is undeniable. At the heart of this campaign were the heavy bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and the B-24 Liberators, flying in massive formations that turned the sky black. The B-24s from Willow Run, each one representing 63 minutes of American labor, were now crossing the English Channel by the hundreds, penetrating deep into German airspace, dropping tens of thousands of tons of bombs on carefully selected targets. And for every aircraft that was shot down by German fighters or flak, for every crew that was killed or captured, there were 10 more bombers crossing the Atlantic to replace them, fresh from American factories. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. For 6 days, thousands of Allied bombers, escorted by long-range fighters, pounded German factories, airfields, and production facilities. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich in one of the largest air battles in history, and in those 6 days, it was systematically annihilated. Over 2,600 Allied heavy bombers participated in the raids. Many were B-24 Liberators from Willow Run. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 aircraft, and even more critically, hundreds of experienced pilots who could not be replaced. German pilots, however brave and skilled, were simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The mathematics that Admiral Canaris had tried to communicate were now playing out in the skies over Germany with brutal clarity. For every German fighter that went down, there was only a trickle of replacements coming from German factories, which were themselves under constant bombardment. For every American plane lost, 10 more were being built and shipped across the Atlantic. Luftwaffe fighter groups that had entered Big Week at full strength were reduced to scattered remnants within days. The training programs that produced new pilots could not keep pace with the losses. By mid-1944, the average Luftwaffe pilot had far fewer flying hours than his Allied counterpart, and the quality of German resistance declined even as the desperation increased. It was a brutal war of attrition, exactly the kind of war that Canaris had foreseen and warned against. A war where courage and tactical skill mattered less than industrial capacity and logistical sustainability. And Germany was losing catastrophically. The cities that Hermann Göring had promised would never be bombed were being reduced to ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, dozens of German cities experienced firestorms, massive conflagrations caused by thousands of incendiary bombs that created winds strong enough to uproot trees and temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians died in these raids. Whether this strategic bombing was morally justified remains a subject of intense debate among historians, but its impact on German morale and industrial production is undeniable. A Luftwaffe general, disgusted with Göring's continued detachment from reality, wrote in his personal diary in early 1944, a diary that would be discovered after the war, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, over 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft. He blames our intelligence services for spreading defeatism. He refuses to see what is in front of his eyes. We are being buried by American production, exactly as some of our intelligence officers warned years ago, and there is nothing we can do to stop it." The B-24 Liberators that rolled out of that most enormous room in the history of man, that factory that German intelligence had reported on and German leadership had dismissed as impossible, were now deconstructing the Third Reich piece by piece, target by target, sortie by sortie. They shattered synthetic fuel plants, which crippled the mobility of German armored divisions. They tore up railway marshalling yards, which paralyzed logistics. They obliterated ball-bearing factories, which ground production to a halt across multiple industries. They destroyed oil refineries, leaving the Wehrmacht starving for fuel. By late 1944, German tanks were often abandoned, not because they were destroyed in combat, but because there was no fuel to run them. Luftwaffe fighters sat on airfields, unable to take off because the fuel tanks were empty. The German war machine, that seemingly unstoppable juggernaut that had conquered most of Europe in just a few years, was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory that its leaders had laughed at. The Willow Run bomber plant, combined with dozens of other American factories producing fighters, transports, trainers, and other bombers, had unleashed an industrial avalanche that buried the Third Reich in exactly the way Admiral Canaris had predicted, on that March day in 1943. So what happened to the man who had tried to sound the alarm? What was the fate of the admiral who had delivered the truth that no one wanted to hear? For Wilhelm Canaris, the price of being right, the price of telling uncomfortable truths in a regime built on lies, was steep and ultimately fatal. As the war turned decisively against Germany through 1943 and 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed and the Western Allies landed in Normandy and the strategic bombing campaign intensified, Admiral Canaris found himself increasingly isolated and suspect. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist, presenting sober and accurate assessments, sounded increasingly like treason. The Nazi leadership, confronted with mounting evidence of impending defeat, did not respond by accepting reality and seeking a negotiated settlement. Instead, they doubled down on ideology, blamed saboteurs and defeatists for every setback, and demanded even more fanatical resistance. Canaris's rivals in the SS, particularly Heinrich Himmler and his deputies, saw the Abwehr as a nest of unreliable elements, old-world aristocrats and military professionals who lacked true National Socialist conviction. The SS had its own intelligence service, the SD or Sicherheitsdienst, and there was constant bureaucratic warfare between the Abwehr and the SS for control of Germany's intelligence operations. The SS viewed Canaris with deep suspicion. They monitored his communications, investigated his associates, waited for any evidence of disloyalty that could be used to destroy him. And Canaris's accurate reports on American industrial production weren't seen by the SS as valuable intelligence. They were seen as defeatist propaganda, as evidence that Canaris himself had been compromised, that he was perhaps even working for the enemy. How else, they reasoned, could he be so certain of American capabilities unless he was in contact with Allied intelligence? In the twisted logic of Nazi paranoia, telling the truth became proof of treachery. But Canaris's opposition to the regime went far deeper than just delivering unwelcome intelligence reports. He was not simply a pessimist or a defeatist. He was a man who had become increasingly horrified by what the Nazi regime was doing, particularly the atrocities committed by the SS in occupied territories. The systematic murder of Jews, the mass executions of civilians, the brutal treatment of prisoners of war. All of this violated Canaris's sense of military honor and basic humanity. Using his position as head of the Abwehr, Canaris had quietly worked to shield members of the German resistance, a loose network of military officers, aristocrats, clergy, and intellectuals who opposed Hitler and sought to end the Nazi regime, if necessary through assassination. One of the most notable figures Canaris protected was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran theologian and pastor who was actively involved in resistance activities. Bonhoeffer was officially employed by the Abwehr as an agent, which gave him cover to travel and make contacts, but his real work was with the resistance. Canaris knew this and protected him. The Admiral also engaged in what can only be described as acts of sabotage against Nazi foreign policy. He worked behind the scenes to ensure that Spain, under General Francisco Franco, remained neutral rather than joining the Axis. Hitler had wanted Spanish support, particularly access to Gibraltar, which would have been strategically invaluable in controlling the Mediterranean. Canaris, through careful intelligence work and diplomatic manipulation, helped convince Franco that joining the war would be disastrous for Spain. This was an act of deliberate sabotage that cost Hitler dearly, but it was done so carefully that Canaris was never directly implicated at the time. The final blow to Canaris came in the aftermath of the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler. A group of German military officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair. The bomb exploded, but Hitler survived, protected by the heavy oak table he had been leaning over. The Gestapo investigation that followed was massive and merciless. Thousands of people were arrested, interrogated, tortured. The Nazi regime was determined to root out every member of the resistance, to crush any possibility of future opposition. Many trails in this investigation led back to the Abwehr. Canaris had been dismissed from his position as head of the Abwehr in February 1944, as the SS finally maneuvered to take control of military intelligence, but the conspirators had used Abwehr networks and contacts. In the months after the July 20th plot, the Gestapo uncovered more and more evidence. Canaris was arrested in September 1944. His personal diaries were discovered, revealing the full depth of his opposition to the Nazi regime, his connections with resistance members, his sabotage of German war efforts. What followed was months of imprisonment, interrogation, and torture. Canaris was held in various SS facilities, moved from place to place as the Allied armies closed in on Germany. He was not given a trial. There was no formal legal proceeding. In the final chaotic weeks of the war, as Hitler raged in his bunker in Berlin and the Third Reich disintegrated around him, the Führer signed execution orders for the captured resistance members. It was pure vengeance, pointless and cruel, but it was consistent with Hitler's character. On April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany's final surrender, in the courtyard of Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was executed. The method was deliberately brutal and humiliating. He was slowly strangled to death with piano wire, a method the Nazis reserved for traitors. He was stripped naked, denied any dignity in his final moments. Witnesses reported that he faced his death with remarkable composure, a career officer maintaining his bearing even at the end. It was a brutal, degrading conclusion to the life of a man who had seen the future with perfect clarity, who had tried to warn his country of the disaster that awaited, and who had ultimately worked to sabotage the regime when his warnings were ignored. Wilhelm Canaris was murdered by the very regime he had tried to save from its own ideological blindness. He delivered the message that could have changed the course of the war, or at least shortened it and saved countless lives. And for his trouble, he was branded a traitor and erased. When the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, when the Nazi regime finally collapsed in an orgy of destruction, and the Allied armies met in the ruins of Berlin, when the most devastating conflict in human history finally ended, the final numbers proved just how right Admiral Canaris had been. The intelligence report that had landed on his desk in March 1943, the report that had been laughed at and dismissed as impossible, wasn't just accurate. It was actually an understatement of what American industry would achieve.